Did you catch the announcement? Shopify Editions 2024 just went live late last month with the theme of unification. Obviously, each time Shopify does one of these twice yearly editions, they announce a ton of new stuff. But for theme developers specifically, there's one announcement that combined with the previously announced theme blocks will together represent a huge shift in how themes will be customized in the future. A change unlike anything we've seen since Online Store 2.0 was announced in 2021. While neither of these changes to the theme editor have been released just yet, the fact that Shopify have kept the concept of theme blocks alive under the umbrella of Flex sections and have now added style settings, it gives me a lot of faith that Shopify will actually release this feature. So to get a head start on understanding Flex sections, let me take you through the developer preview so you can see how Flex sections are intended to work behind the scenes. All right, so here I am inside my newly created developer preview store. As you can see here, it says non-transferable Flex sections preview. Obviously, I had to create this video ahead of time while I was planning it, but I'll put a video on screen right now of how I created it. You just add a development store, choose what development preview you want, and add some test data, and then click the button to create the store, and you'll arrive at the same point. Except I have created this super gutted out theme. So if I go into here and click edit code, you'll see that this is a very, very bare bones theme. If we click to preview the store is just the name of the store in a H1. That is it. Very, very bare bones. So if we go into here, we've just got an index.liquid with the shop name inside H1s, a very basic theme.liquid file, no files in our sections folder, no files in this new blocks folder, no snippets, obviously some config because you can't run a theme without it, no assets and no locales, okay? So in the previous video where I talked about theme blocks, I looked at the reference theme. So here I've got the reference theme. I encourage you to look at that and reference your code against this reference theme. You can see here that this is fully built out with different blocks. And if we head into the customizer for this theme, you can see here how Shopify have built this theme and how it all works in the theme editor. I could use this video to talk about this, but I already talked about this in that video on Shopify Winter Editions 2024. So I won't do that again. Instead, what I'm going to do in this video is build from scratch. And I think that gives us a much better understanding of how this works and the limitations once we start to build ourselves using this new paradigm. One thing you might notice in this developer preview store is no matter what theme I'm on, there is now a blocks folder in the theme folder. So if I go down to even debut and click edit code, you can see that there is a blocks folder. It might be empty, but there is a blocks folder because in this online theme editor, we can't create or delete folders. So Shopify have just included the blocks folder for us on all the different themes. Of course, there's other ways to affect the folder structure. We can use the Shopify CLI or theme kit. However, when I was preparing this video, I noticed that theme kit doesn't actually acknowledge the blocks folder. So if you write anything in the blocks folder using theme kit, those files are not recognized by theme kit and uploaded to the theme. So if you do like to use theme kit, it's not going to work with this new paradigm, at least for now. So as mentioned at the start of the video, these new Flex sections incorporate two new features that are coming out soon. It incorporates style settings, which was just announced, and theme blocks, which was announced 6 months ago at the Winter Edition. So in this video, I'm going to cover theme blocks first, and then we'll move on to style settings, okay? So let's open up the documentation for theme blocks. And as you can read in the documentation here, theme blocks are going to operate a lot like sections. So it's using a lot of the same technology, but there's a few key differences which we'll talk about in this video. So if we go back to the reference theme, click customize on that to take a look at the reference theme, you can see that there's a lot of these sections called custom sections, right? Because sections have become even more modular, the section itself has become more bare. You can see actually the style settings here. We'll get to that later, but apart from the style settings, there's not really anything in the section settings itself because the content of the section is going to be a lot more dynamic based on these different blocks that are grouped together by these group blocks. And if we look inside the code here and we go to custom section, you'll see that there's not a lot of HTML in here. We've just got the style settings and we've got this right here to say that it accepts theme blocks and app blocks. How we output the list of blocks is via this code right here, which is very simple, content for blocks. Okay, so taking that as inspiration, let's go into our own theme now that we're working with for this video. And let's create a custom section. I'm just going to call this custom section. And so of course we've got a schema, custom section is going to be the name. And in order to be able to select it in our theme editor, we're going to need a preset. So I'm going to open up presets here, name, custom section. And then we're going to have no settings, but what we're going to have is blocks, and we're going to open up an array with two different types. So we'll say type, and we'll put @theme, which the @ symbol is kind of like dynamic. It's like a special keyword. And we can do the same for app blocks as well. Type @app. So we'll be able to put app blocks alongside theme blocks in this section. Theme blocks just meaning that blocks that we have in our blocks folder here that we've written ourselves. The alternative being section specific blocks, which are currently the only types of blocks apart from app blocks at present. So you should be familiar that we would usually just write the specification for the blocks within this array right here in the schema. But now with theme blocks, we just type in type theme. Okay. So here I'm just going to open up a section tag. I'm going to give it the class of custom, and then all I need to do is put in that dynamic content for, and then in quotes blocks. There's not really any other options to slide in there. So I'm just going to hit save on that. Okay. Now, as we saw in the reference theme, this new system allows for multi-level nesting, which means that we can group our blocks together. So we can create basically divs to hold different bits of content and then rearrange the content within those divs, or rearrange the divs within the section. So what I'm going to do is, just like in the reference theme, I'm going to create a group. And here you can see we've got a block schema, which is very similar to the section schema, almost identical at present. And just like sections, we actually need to put in a preset in order to select this block from the theme editor. So right here, name group. And then for group, all I'm going to do is put in a div here with the class of group. Another thing that's important to note here is that there's this new attribute here called tag. So we can actually customize what tag this block shows up as. I haven't actually tried this before. Let's just say the anchor tag. All right, and then let's actually have a look at this. So I'm going to click to customize theme, which should open up in a new tab. Let me just put something in the group for now. So I'll just say group so we can see that it's actually working. As you can see here, it says this page doesn't have any sections, and that's because it's currently an index.liquid file. We need to change this to an index.json file. So I'm going to delete that and then add back the index as a JSON template. And that should give us a blank boilerplate JSON template. I don't think it has. Let me just refresh. Usually they give us some boilerplate code. If we use the online editor, it says it doesn't exist. Okay, maybe we need to write in our boilerplate code ourselves. So index.json sections. I think that's all we need to have a working schema. So I think that has worked. Let's go back to our editor. We've eliminated that issue, but now we got no sections showing up. So I'll put in custom with the type of custom, and then make sure to put that in the order array custom. Custom does not relate to an existing section file. That's because I forgot to put custom section. So just in the type, I need to put dash section, and then let's refresh over here. Okay, cool. So now we've got our custom section, no settings within it, but we can add a block and we can add one of these groups. Okay. These groups currently don't do anything really. It just says group, but I can add multiple of these groups. And then once I change the settings on these groups, I can nest groups within these. So let's just create 3 groups and I'll hit save on that. Let's have a look at the code on our front end, because remember I used the A tag in the settings. Here you can see that the parent HTML of the block is now an A tag. Doesn't really make sense unless I'm going to put a href in there. Let's just say we wanted it to be a span instead. So if we refresh over here, inspect, now you can see that the parent block element is a span rather than a div. I haven't thought of any situations in which I might need to use that, but I thought it was wise to mention this in this video. Okay, so these groups, just like the custom section, are just created in order to provide structure and hold the content for nested blocks. So I'll just copy the content underscore for blocks. And then in here, actually, we can just basically copy this and put this here. Okay, I'll hit save on that, refresh over here. And now you can see we can add blocks within these blocks. So we can nest groups within groups. Not particularly handy. What I want to show in this example is create some elements, like let's create a 3-column layout with an image, a piece of text, and a button. So we can break up each of those elements into its own block. So here in the blocks folder, I'm going to create a new block and we'll call it image.liquid. Now, an image block like this exists in the reference theme, so it's probably better just to copy the code exactly from the reference theme. But to make this a little bit simpler, I'm going to, again, give it a preset and just put in a really simple image. All right. Obviously, you want to output images in an optimized way so that it doesn't use more data than it should. Just look at the image.liquid block example on the reference theme if you want to see what I'm talking about. But for me, I'm just going to put image src, and then we're just going to take, actually, we need to put this in the settings. So I'm going to create a setting where the user can add in an image of their choice, just like I would do normally in a section schema. So I don't really need to call this anything other than image. So I'll give it the ID of image and the label of image. Okay, and then in here, instead of section settings, of course, we're not in a section, we're going to do block.settings.image. And then of course we need to use the image URL filter. I'm going to make the width like 200 and then close that image tag right there. And then actually, before we build this, I'm going to create the next one, which I'm just going to call single line text. All right, super simple. And here I'm just going to put in a setting for text. The ID can be text. As you can see, guys, this is super modular. Label, text. And then in order to include it, we're going to need it as a preset. So I'll add a preset with the name of single line text. And then I also got to update the block name up here, single line text. And then up here, it's going to be very simple. Just going to have a div with the class of single line text block. And inside this div, obviously, I'm just going to output whatever the user has set in the text field below it. Okay. Very simple little blocks here. And then finally, I'm going to do a button block, change this to button. And just like any button, we'll need two settings. We'll need the text of the button and where it's going to link to. So type text, ID, text, just like we did for the previous example. And then the second one is the actual link where the button's going to go to. So I'll do type URL, ID of link, label of link, and then we're going to need a preset, of course, which is going to be the name of button. So then up here, we'll put in our HTML, href, which will be block settings link, and then in between the A tags, opening and closing, we're going to put in block settings text. Okay, and then what I like to do, whoops, thought I was trying to leave the page. What I like to do is make sure it doesn't show unless there is some content in block settings text. So if block setting text is not blank, then we'll show it. All right, so now that we've created our group and we've got 3 different blocks here, we don't want to nest any blocks within these blocks. So we're not going to put a blocks array in this block, unlike we did for this group here. But now this is going to give us 3 levels of nesting, which is a big step up from what we had before of only 2 levels of nesting with the previous paradigm with sections only having 1 layer of blocks underneath it. So now we've got 3 groups and we can click this button to add an image. I'm going to go in here and just take a picture of the snowboard. Then I'm going to add in single line text. The text is just going to be snowboard. And then if I go in here, I can click on button. And then let's just say view product. And then I'll search for, I think it's a picture of the Collection Snowboard Liquid, but whatever, it doesn't really matter. I'll go ahead and do the same for these other two groups, so bear with me. This picture of yellow wax. And finally, I'll put in purple wax. Here you can see I get a broken image indicator there. That's because I didn't check if the image is set before outputting the tag. So I might fix that in a little bit. I'll call this purple wax. This product didn't actually exist in my test data, but I've created a product for that. So if I go into products here, you can see I created a product called purple wax. All right, so I'll hit save on that. And we currently don't have any styling, so they're not sitting side by side. They're just stacking on top, and the link has a normal link format. But what I'll do is I'll add CSS in just a second. First, I want to do what I said before and just check that an image has been set before I try and output an image tag. So if block settings image is not blank, then I'll output the image tag. All right, and then I will go in and include some CSS to style this a little bit nicer. Let's create a blank theme.css file. I'll paste in some code that I've already written, and then all I need to do is make sure to include that CSS file in my theme.liquid file, which I can do via the link tag with the asset URL filter on the file name of the CSS file. Okay, so I'll hit save on that. Let's look at our page again, and looks like I missed a few classes here. So let me just fix that. I want to put button block class on this one and single line text block. That should be correct. Yeah, so it was just the button that didn't have its class. So here you can see not perfectly beautiful, but at least we've got a little nicer styling. And if I refresh over in the customizer, you'll see the same thing. So if we play around with this in the customizer, you can see that now the user can rearrange these groups however they want. Each column can be moved into a different position. And if for whatever reason somebody wanted the view product button above the image, they could do that as well. So in the past, we would have to create a section and we would call it something like 3-column section. And then we would have to have blocks for every column that would have been specified on the section itself. And then because we can't nest blocks within blocks, we wouldn't be able to rearrange blocks within each of the columns. Not that this is a very practical example. I'm not sure. Design-wise, you would want this order to be consistent anyway across all the columns. But I'm sure we'll see once this feature comes into production, how people are using it in various ways. It's really going to exponentially increase the possibilities of the theme editor. Okay, so custom section, we saw that example in the reference theme, and I think that's going to be the most common example. As we saw on the reference theme, there are the new style settings that have been added to the custom section. We'll add those settings to our custom section as well in a bit, but there's two other concepts before we move on to style settings that I wanted to make reference to that didn't really fit into the previous example. So in between cuts, what I've done is I've created a section called table. So if I click add section, I can add a table section, and this table section can add in table rows. And then within table rows, we can add in table cells. Now to get that level of restriction, what I did was if we go over to sections and we look at the table section, you can see here that while here I can put @theme, and that allows us to insert whatever theme block we have in our blocks folder. We can be more specific and target a very specific block. So as we can see here in the blocks folder, I created table row and table cell. Now, this example of a table, maybe not the most practical example, but it was one that I could think of in terms of a structure in which you only want to nest a certain thing at each level. So for instance, with this custom section, we could change this to just only be groups, but maybe there's a possibility we would want one of the columns to be an image as well. So we could change this to group, and then it would be restricted only to group. In this table example, you can see that the only thing we want to nest within a table are table rows. So we can restrict to just that type of block. And then inside table row, we can specify the type of table cell because we only want to put table cells inside a table row. So just to complete this example, let's just say we made a table and let's create a few rows here, a few columns, and let's say that this is the header row, and then we can add more rows here. And as you can see, when we're inside a row, we can only add cells, and when we're inside the table section itself, we can only add rows. So it's pretty hard here to mess it up. So let's just say snowboard and price $200, let's say. And I wanted to bring this up because with all this added flexibility that's coming with nested blocks, or theme blocks as Shopify are calling them, I see the biggest challenge for developers is how do we actually remove that flexibility when we need to? So this is one example of how we could do that. But unfortunately, it seems that we can't actually restrict to a list of block types. So say for instance, I went into my group block here and I didn't want to be able to add another group within a group. I can't just go button, image, single line text in a comma separated format. You'll see here I get a red squiggly line and it says the string does not match the pattern. So it does not allow commas. So at present, it looks like we can't restrict it to a certain list that we specify. It either has to be all the theme blocks within the blocks folder or a specific type. Okay, so that's one thing I wanted to note. The other thing is static blocks. So if we go back to the documentation for theme blocks, there should be somewhere here about static blocks. Here we go, statically rendered in Liquid. Okay, so if we look at the documentation for static blocks, we can take one of the blocks in our blocks folder and we can statically render it in Liquid. So in this case, it almost becomes like a snippet. Basically, once the block is in, it doesn't really operate like a block. It's not going to be able to be reordered within the section, which is kind of native block functionality. It seems to be just a way to use code within the blocks folder in a static way. So in the reference theme, you'll see the example of slideshow controls. This block down the bottom, we don't want to actually move it, and it's just fixed to the slideshow because we always need those slideshow controls. And I think if we click into the settings of that, we can hide and unhide, okay? And the way we include it is instead of content for blocks, we do content for block. So rather than read about that, let's actually look at that in the reference theme itself. So I'll open up the theme editor and I'll open up the code for the reference theme. Over here in the theme editor, you can see we've got these slides here and we can add more slides, but this block here, slideshow controls, is fixed. If I try to reorder it, you'll see it doesn't work. I'm clicking and dragging here to be clear, and it's not working. All right, if I wanted to click here and add, oh, that's going into the next section, but you can see here when I try to add in a block, it doesn't allow me to add slideshow controls. And slideshow controls just has one setting in here. I can change the pagination style. So theoretically, we could just put that same code on the section settings, I believe, but to have it nested underneath the section in the UI, we can use a static block. And so if I go over here to the slideshow section, you can see in the blocks array, we're only talking about slides. But then down here, if there's more than one slide, then we're going to render that static block. The type here, I believe, is targeting the file name. So we should be able to find slideshow controls in our blocks folder. And then here you can see it's basically just a snippet of code. And the schema is just to give us this one setting. But once again, theoretically, I believe that we could just put these slideshow controls directly into the slideshow section itself. And we could simply just add that setting to the list of section settings. So I don't really see static blocks as a very exciting or important feature in this new release. All right, that being said, let's talk about style settings. So let me see if I go back enough. Can I find Flex Sections Developer Preview? style settings, and then here's the link for the documentation for style settings. Again, this is on developer preview, so none of this is live just yet. And if we scroll down, we can read all about it. How style settings work is very different to normal input settings in the sense that we create these panels, not these singular settings. So as you can see here, the very familiar attributes of type, ID, label, default, and info. But when we create one of these style settings, we're just creating a panel for size, spacing, or layout. And the settings within these panels has already been defined for us. And then once we include this in our theme, you'll see there's a very interesting way that Shopify uses this information within the theme to actually affect the style. So even though size is first, I want to go with spacing first. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this code. And as you can see, you just copy this code and you'll get exactly this on your front end. So you're typing in code for essentially one setting, but you get a panel with multiple different fields. Okay, so let's go over to our custom section. Let me close down a lot of these. And then inside our custom section, we just need to open up our settings array and insert this code right here. This is going to give us our default padding. So I'm just going to make this a little bit more realistic. Maybe let's just say 10 pixels, or maybe 20 pixels. We can always change it later. And then I'll hit save on that. Now we're not using it in our code yet, so it won't actually affect our front end. But if I go over here and reload and go into our custom section, you'll now see we have the spacing panel with the default values. One of the things I don't really like about this spacing panel is that we can't put a value for auto in here. So you can't see it, but I'm trying to type the word auto in here. It doesn't work. I have to put in a pixel value. So we can't set automatic margins so that this will float in the middle. The other thing you might have noticed when I put in this panel is we've got our market selector, which is new in the last few years. We've obviously got our selector to choose what template we're looking at, but then we've got this third selector here next to the template selector for breakpoint. So as you can see, we can actually use this to create styles that only affect mobile. Now there's a few limitations to this. Obviously there's only one breakpoint and they specify it at 750. So if in our theme we want a different breakpoint, I don't believe that they give us the ability to change the value of the breakpoint, which is a pretty big limitation because if you're building a bespoke theme, your breakpoint might be at 768 or it might be at 999. It depends on what you're building. So the fact that they only give you a breakpoint of 750 is a bit of an annoying restriction. We'll get back to the mobile breakpoints a little later. First, we actually got to take these values and apply them to the section because currently we have inserted the panel, but we're not actually using those values. So how do we actually use these with style settings? Well, if we scroll down in the documentation to usage, you'll see that it's very different to how we use input settings normally. So with input settings, we would put in the input that we're looking for, and then we just take the value that the user sets. With these panels, it's a little bit different. Instead, what we do is we take the object of the panel and we pass it through class list, and then we get all these classes on our element, whichever element that we put this code on, and then there's a lot of magic that happens behind the scenes, which I'll show you very shortly. But as you can see here, within theme settings, we just go settings.layout. This is the example of layouts. We've got spacing, size, and layout. But in the example of layout, we just go settings.layout, in the section, section.settings.layout, in a block, block.settings.layout. Okay. But for us, we've got a spacing panel. So we're not going to do layout at present. We're going to do this same code, but spacing instead. So I'm just going to copy this and let's go over here. And before we actually put this in as the example, I want to show you what actually comes out if we put in, what was it, spacing here. And we're going to need to change this word to section because we're in a section, not a block. And let's see what the output of just that object is. Now we're getting a bit of an error. I'm not sure why that is the case. It says unexpected character. Maybe it was a weird character that was coming through from the copy and paste. So let me just add in those spaces again, see if that works. Okay, now it works. It must have been some weird copy and paste issue. All right, so now if I go over and refresh over here, you'll see that the output of that object is a style settings drop. Now within this style settings drop, you might think that we can chain a dot to get to a specific attribute, but that's not documented at all in the documentation. Maybe that is coming later and we'll be able to target specific attributes within this object. But for now, this object doesn't really do anything unless we pass it through this filter of class list. Okay, so let's take that, put it inside our classes for the section after custom, and then we should start to see the magic of style settings come through on our front end. So I'll refresh in the theme editor first, and now you should see that there is some padding to the left and some padding to the top. If I was to exaggerate this, let's say 50, you can see that that is definitely affecting. So that's very interesting. Let's go over here now and inspect our code and see how this is actually working. So let me go in here to inspect. And if we look at the actual element here where we put the class list on, you'll see we get all these weird classes. They have these colons in them: styles, colon spacing, styles, colon section, colon custom section. And what's interesting about this is none of these classes explicitly tell us what the padding values are. So let's dive deeper. I'll move this a bit over and let's look in the panel, down here for styles. And as you can see here, we've got our style still coming through from theme.css, but then you can see we've got all these variables. So the styles colon spacing is going to bring in all of these padding and margin variables. And so where do these come from? If we click on these, we can go in and see that these are coming from the Shopify styles.base.default CSS layer. So I wanted to see where these were actually coming from in our code. So if we run a find on this, I guess because there's no value for them, it's not really coming through. Or sometimes the search function is not great on here. Let me search this a different way. I know that there's, from looking at this previously, there's going to be a style tag with an attribute called data-shopify-style-overrides. And if I open this up, you can see that this is where the variables are stored. So if we dive deeper into where the 20 pixel padding is coming from, if we look at computed, you can definitely see padding coming from the left, 20 pixels. If I go in here and click here to figure out where that's coming from, click here, we've obviously got a variable with 20. Can't find it in here, but it's coming from styles.css, which looks to be a file generated by Shopify when you use style settings. Here you can see examples of breakpoints. And if you're not familiar with layers, I had to brush up on what layers do before I recorded this video. But essentially, the use of layers means that it's still going to maintain our base level CSS. So this takes precedence. So if for instance, I added padding here to the left of 50, it's going to go with my defined CSS first. But if I don't have that, then the code from the layer will come through, which I find interesting. It maintains your code from your CSS. If you did want it to override your default CSS, then yeah, you would have to come up with a solution for that. I'll give you a more practical example in the next style panel that we will apply, which is the layout. Okay, so before, when our little 3-column layout didn't have any CSS, if I just remove this, it just stacked on top of each other and we wanted it to align like this. Well, we can do that with the style settings. So here, I'll take the example code word for word, and then I will paste it under here. So that'll create a new panel for us. And what's interesting again is that we get an error even with the example code. So it says property display is not allowed, which is interesting given we copied the example directly from Shopify. But let's just remove these errors. I think they're redundant anyway. And in order to make this come through, what we can do is we can add in another one of these and say layout. But to make things simple, we don't actually have to create this tag multiple times. We can just remove dot spacing, and then it'll automatically put through the CSS classes from any panels we have in our section settings, okay? So again, the magic continues, and we go over here. Let's refresh in our theme editor. And as you can see here, we can change the flex direction. If the number of items was overflowing, we could set it to wrap. We can change the gap, which currently we won't be able to do because we've already set it in our CSS. I'll show you how that works. And we can also align items and justify, which is really cool. So I'll change this to justify center, and then let's look at how this magic is applying. So we set it to wrap, so it's going to wrap on this smaller screen size. Maybe I set this to not wrap. Okay, now they're lining up side by side. So let's inspect our section here. Now we've got even more of these crazy classes. And if we scroll down, you can see that we have some styles here with variables for the styles layout flex class up here. Okay, so it's very interesting. It's doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes with CSS that it creates itself. It loads variables and styles into a layer, and then through these special classes, it loads in the values of what the user sets in the theme editor into the element. So very different system to what we are used to with normal input elements. A lot of magic, which is really nice out of the box, but then in order to customize and in order to break this functionality, doesn't seem to be many options at the moment. Like for instance, we can't actually change the gap here because the gap in this setting is stored in the layer. So like I showed you before, if we were to set this to 100, it's still not going to work because in our CSS, if I inspect the element again on the section, you can see it's still maintaining the gap that we set in our own CSS file. So if we wanted to override that setting, I'm not sure what our options are here with that layer. We'd definitely have to write some code in order for this value to be overridden. Otherwise, we can just remove this from the code altogether. So if we look at it here and we look at the gap now, it's only 20. Let me go back to here. Maybe I didn't save. Hit save on this with 100 pixel padding. Refresh over here. Of course, it's going to go to the CSS that we set. But if I remove that, now you can see if we go to column gap, it's 100, which is the value. It says 20 here, but it's obviously coming through as 100. But as you can see, the value that we set in the style panel will come through if it hasn't already been set in our CSS. All right, to finish off this video, let's now look at the size panel, and then let's look at the mobile breakpoint setting as well. So very similar to the other ones, we just throw this panel in here. The code is pretty standard. Let's just change the default value of width to 100%. And we don't need to do anything over here because we're not saying layout, size, or actually you can see the options coming up there. Layout, size, or spacing. We're just passing the whole settings objects through class list, and we should get all the necessary classes just by doing that. So refreshing over here, we've got our final panel, the size panel. And you can see here, we can do some dynamic widths here. And in both of these panels, we can actually add in extra properties. So it makes sense here if we wanted to create a container. So let's give this a max width of 1440, right? Which is not going to show up unless we get to a much bigger screen size. Maybe let's dial this down because my screen is a little bit shrunken for the purposes of this video. If we go down to here, now you can see it's a bit off to the side, but it doesn't give us the option to do margin auto, which, as I mentioned before, was a bit annoying. And then width 100% within that max width container. And then say, for instance, it was like a hero section with an image, we can set a custom height. As you can see here, it's going to 500, or we can just set it to fit the content or fill the page or auto. Okay, so I hit save on that. Let's have a look at our front end again. Actually, I'm going to put the panel down here again so we can inspect the section, and you can see now it's restricted to that max width of 990. And then in order to get it to the center, I would just have to put margin auto into my CSS file because it's not actually an option at present in the actual style panel, which I find interesting because that's a pattern that is very common in responsive web development, to put something in a max width container and then set the margins to auto, so that, if we are to resize the window, we get resizing margins. Okay, so it's interesting that Shopify did not put that option within this margin here to do automatic margins. We have to do specific pixel margins. All right, so finally, let's talk about the mobile breakpoint. So on mobile, as we often do in mobile responsive web development, we don't want this to be horizontal anymore. We'd prefer the direction to be vertical. And let's just say we want this to be in the center. Okay, this is on the default breakpoint. So if we go back here, we're actually on the default breakpoint. Let me now go into mobile, and that will automatically change us to the mobile view. Now at this point, I will change the direction, and you can see this green indicator here to say that this is customized for this specific breakpoint. If I go back to the default breakpoint, you see it'll go back to the original setting, but on mobile, it'll give us a different value that we set. If I hit save on that, using the magic of these weird classes, that should now apply. So if I go down to a mobile viewport width, you will see now that the flex direction is column. Okay, so a lot of magic with the CSS behind the scenes, but what I think is really cool about this is that the user can set different values based on different breakpoints. But at current, it's only just the one breakpoint. They might change this in future or allow us to program it. Obviously, this is in developer preview, but this will be really handy because the amount of settings that I have to double up on when I create themes for desktop or mobile is a lot. So to recycle the same settings, but just have them apply to either desktop or mobile, is a super cool feature. Again, it's just the issue of the breakpoint being determined for you. And so with style settings and theme blocks discussed, that is covering basically everything that is coming out with flex sections in, we don't know when. I was going to say the near future, but could be 6 months, could be 12 months. We'll just have to wait and see. But this is going to be a game changer when it comes out. So as you can see, guys, flex sections are really going to shift how themes are built once they come out. To me, it feels like a similar paradigm shift as Online Store 2.0, where before templates were filled with liquid code. Of course, JSON templates were then introduced, pushing all the liquid into sections in order to be more dynamic. And soon enough, with flex sections, we should start to see sections thin down as well as we push more code down the chain into the smaller modules of blocks. Of course, this is only a developer preview, so we don't really know for sure what will make the final cut when this feature is eventually released. But if Shopify really do allow blocks to be nested within each other, then it's really going to provide a ton of flexibility. So much flexibility, in fact, that it should hopefully replace the need for a lot of merchants to use third-party page building apps. With this much flexibility, however, it could present a new challenge for theme developers, the challenge of making sure themes are even more robust given the exponential increase in possible section block combinations that a change like this should produce. But anyways, guys, that's all I'll say on flex sections until we hear more back from Shopify about them. For now, just a quick announcement of my own for anyone interested in becoming a Shopify theme developer. I just released a free high-quality mini-course for existing web developers to learn more about how custom development works on Shopify. You can find that by navigating to the link on your screen or checking out the first link in the description. Happy coding, and I'll see you on the next one.